Madam President, I come to the floor this afternoon to talk about two issues of vital importance to the United States and the world. First, I want to say a few words about the current violence paralyzing Israel and the Palestinian territories, but then I want to spend the bulk of my remarks on the future of nuclear proliferation in the Middle East. First, here in America, our hearts are breaking for Israelis and Palestinians. The images are just bone-chilling. Rockets and interceptors streaking across the night sky, parents huddled with their children as air raid sirens ring out. Tragic images of innocent Israeli and Palestinian civilians, including children injured or killed in the blasts. For many Americans who are turning on the news this week, it might appear that the events of the last few days erupted almost overnight. And while tensions are now reaching a fever and deadly pitch, this cataclysm has been long in the making, and no party, including the United States of America, has completely clean hands. Zero-sum politics has driven both the decision-making of the Netanyahu government and Palestinian leadership, to the extent that there is such thing as Palestinian leadership. And those decisions have led us to this crisis. Over and over, Prime Minister Netanyahu has pushed Israeli settlements further into territory historically considered reserved for a future Palestinian state. The Israeli government, increasingly reliant on right-wing zero-sum political constituencies for its survival, also stepped up campaigns to remove Palestinians from areas in East Jerusalem as a means to undermine the Palestinian claim to that section of the ancient city as the capital of a future state. The spark that lit the match of the existing conflagration was the Israeli effort to remove Palestinian families from their homes in the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah and replace them with Israeli settlers. In February, an Israeli court ordered Palestinian families in that neighborhood to vacate their homes by May 2nd, or they would be forcibly removed. Protests began and spread to other cities in Israel with large Arab populations, while the Palestinian families awaited a final ruling from the Israeli Supreme Court. As these protests spread and grew in size, Israeli police adopted some tactics that we have seen on display here in the United States, an overly securitized approach that only escalated rather than diffused the tension. Those crackdowns led to more protests and more clashes in a cycle that continued and continued. Then, Israeli security forces stormed Islam's third holiest site in Jerusalem during Ramadan prayers. Now, the Israelis contend that they were responding to rock throwing from Palestinians inside. The Palestinians argue that it was the other way around. But whatever happened, at the end of that night, more than 330 Palestinians and 22 Israelis had been injured. The story of the Palestinians' conduct over the last decade is just as important in understanding the roots of the existing crisis. Fatah, the main political party representing Palestinians, has failed the people that it represents. Rife with internal conflict and corruption, Fatah lost its mandate to govern Gaza in 2006 when Hamas, an internationally recognized terrorist organization, beat Fatah in parliamentary elections there that year. Hamas refuses to recognize the right of Israel to exist and advocates for the armed rebellion of Palestinians against Israel. Fatah, under pressure from Hamas to take the more extreme position, spent most of the last decade refusing any and all chance to negotiate with the Israelis, preferring to sit on the sidelines and nurture grievances. And they were unable to deliver any real economic benefit to the people under their charge in the West Bank, and the resulting desperation of Palestinians fed this grievance culture even more. In response to those events I mentioned at Al-Aqsa, Hamas and its allies in Gaza started firing rockets into southern and central Israel. Since that day, thousands of rockets have landed inside Israel. These rocket attacks were then responded to by an Israeli government that has begun its own assault inside Gaza. And as we sit here today, hundreds of Palestinians inside Gaza, including children, have been killed. And though there have not been as many casualties inside Israel. Because of the defense security relationship with the United States, Israelis have been killed as well. The Israelis were wrong to pursue settlements and evictions as a deliberate means to undermine a future Palestinian state. These policies might have helped hold together Netanyahu's political coalition, but they helped feed a sense of hopelessness amongst Palestinians and their future. The Palestinian leadership was wrong to perpetuate an anti-Israeli, anti-Semitic narrative as a foundation of their hold on power. They were wrong to choose grievance over diplomacy. But, Madam President, the United States, over the last 4 years, we played a role too. President Trump rejected America's historic role as a broker for peace and reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians. He chose a side unconditionally, and his alliance with Netanyahu and his rejection of a Palestinian state drove the two parties further apart and turned the temperature up. Trump pursued a path to intentionally create division rather than healing. And those 4 years of America's absence from his traditional post of mediator is also a big reason of why we are here today. So there's going to be time to talk about the big picture, to talk about what went wrong, how American policy needs to change towards Israel and the West Bank and Gaza. But right now, our focus needs to be laser-like on de-escalation, on a ceasefire. Hamas must stop its rocket attacks. They are war crimes. They are indiscriminate. They do nothing to help the Palestinians in East Jerusalem or anywhere else. And Israel needs to stand down its military campaign as well. Have to take off the table a ground invasion of Gaza. Israel possesses disproportionate military power. That's why during the 2014 invasion of Gaza, 2,000 Palestinians died compared with less than 100 Israelis. But when children die in Gaza, it does nothing to secure Israel. In fact, it does the opposite. It just provides further fuel to this furnace of grievances. So I'm glad that the administration is sending Deputy Assistant Secretary Amr to the region, that he's there. It's critical that we also get a formal U.S. ambassador to Israel in place as quickly as possible. But the United States needs to be pressing for a ceasefire. The United States can't afford to simply allow for this escalation to continue. That's not in Israel's best interest. That's not in America's best interest. And my hope is that in the conversations that are happening today between the Biden administration and the Netanyahu government, that they are talking about the terms to bring this violence to an end.